In an earlier video, I shared my viewpoint on how to handle situations where you're attempting to present a defense for the faith with someone or to someone who is not at all interested in listening, who is focused on attacking and tearing into your position without heeding your words. Again, not talking about whether this person really disagrees, but whether this person is being belligerent or dismissive. And I offered some guidelines that I think apply most effectively in face-to-face communications. I also touched on Matthew 7 verse 6, which talks about how we should not be casting our pearls before swine and what that means. The idea being that if somebody is outright dismissive, if he's taking these holy things you're offering, or these nuggets of truth that you're attempting to share, or your viewpoints, and just trampling them underfoot, in other words, not even making an honest attempt to understand them, then the discussion really isn't worthwhile. Now, when it comes to discussions on the internet, say on an internet discussion board, or on Usenet, or for those older people among you, or even the comment sections on YouTube videos, the dynamic is somewhat different. See, in face-to-face communications, you have more of a give and take. You can still have that in internet communications, but it's more difficult for a variety of reasons. One is that most people are not used to thinking in a strictly linear fashion or in anything close to a logical fashion. They don't tend to think in terms of whether their conclusions are properly derived from their premises or their arguments. Now, when it comes to face-to-face interactions, you can kind of keep that under control. But on the internet, it's much more difficult, especially since the internet tends to depersonalize these communications. As a result, people tend to be more belligerent, they tend to be more argumentative, they tend to act more like jerks than they would when talking to someone face to face. And they therefore feel they can get away with more outrageous behavior. Another complication is that when it comes to a discussion board, for example, you can have a pylon, where you can have people one person going in all sorts of directions with his arguments. That's difficult enough to deal with. But when you have a dozen people doing that, piling on, the discussion can quickly become chaotic. The same thing can be true of Christians behaving when they misbehave in that manner, by the way. I see that more on the part of people who are angry at Christianity or who have an axe to grind against Christianity, presumably and hopefully because Christianity is a tempering influence on people. That's not always the case though, and that's unfortunate. So, how do you deal with people who are being belligerent on the internet? That's more difficult. First of all, you're more likely to encounter people wherein it's obvious that they are, where the injunction in Matthew 7 verse 6 applies. Do not cast your pearls before swine. Precisely because the internet can bring out the worst in people. So you have to recognize that these discussions often will tend to be unfruitful. Consider the comments in my YouTube section, for example. I've talked about some of these before. How very often it's very clear right from the start that the discussion is going nowhere and that people are criticizing in an unseemly fashion. One of my favorite examples is one that I've cited previously, wherein I talked about Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, and how the atheistic philosopher Michael Ruse had a lot of issues with that book, how he did not like it, how he felt embarrassed by the work. Some people attempted to argue with me on that issue. One person in particular stood out where he says, do you have a cite? Do you have an exact quote where Michael Ruse said that he did not like, well, what is your source of that quote? If you do not produce that quote, then you are going to be a laughingstock on the internet. This person went far beyond merely asking for a source. The mere fact that he said, you're going to be a laughingstock, showed that he was acting out of anger and outrage. I could go on and on, but hopefully I've covered that in my comments on other videos. I don't want to make this session for bashing these critics. What I want to get across here is that these situations can quickly spiral out of control. So you need to straddle a fine line here. You need to be able to provide a firm defense, but at the same time make it clear that, hey, you know, that some of these people just are not going to be interested in listening and learn to detect those situations. When they're pulling facts out of thin air, for example, saying, well, the Gospels were written 2 centuries afterward, after the death of Christ, it's clear that they're just pulling that out of nowhere or relying on some vague memories. Even liberal sources date the Gospels well within the 1st century. So What else? On YouTube, it's especially difficult because the comments to the videos are limited to only a few characters. You can only post a few sentences worth of rebuttal. That makes it very difficult to offer anything, any sort of substantive remark, any sort of substantive discussion. For that reason, it makes it more difficult to respond graciously, but at the same time firmly and thoroughly. So that's something we need to be aware of. By the way, I moderate the comments in my videos. Not all the Christian apologists here do, but it's something I choose to do. And sometimes people ask why. If some people go so far as to say, "Oh, you moderate them because you're a coward, because you don't want anyone criticizing what you have to say." Now that's patently untrue. I approve a great many comments from critics. I approve them based on a number of criteria. One is, are they being reasonably polite? Sometimes even if they're belligerent, I'll post them anyway. But I prefer to post those. But if you're polite, you're more likely to get your comments posted. Second, does it look like the discussion is actually going to go somewhere? Or is it just going to be a waste of time? For example, when people keep bringing up matters that are irrelevant to the video at hand, when I talk about God's existence and they'll say, "Well, Jesus never existed," which is totally irrelevant to the subject matter, it's easy to see that discussion is going to be fruitless. If it looks like they never actually watched the video in question, then I'm not going to be eager to post their comments or respond to them, because again, that's almost certainly going to be a waste of time. You saw that in the discussions on cosmic fine-tuning, where several people, well, more than one person responded by saying, "You need to read about the anthropic principle. That explains it all." As though completely oblivious to the fact that the videos I posted discuss the anthropic principle in great detail. If you're responding to a video on the anthropic principle by saying, "You need to read about the anthropic principle," obviously you didn't bother to listen. Now, some people don't like the fact that I choose to moderate these discussions. Well, I do it for a number of reasons. One is, I want to keep the discussions on track. Imagine a classroom situation, for example, where if you have one student who keeps who keeps dominating the discussion, or keeps trying to veer discussion off track, perhaps unintentionally, but nonetheless derailing the discussion, the teacher may need to get firm and say, "You know what? That's enough. We need to keep the discussion on focus." The sad thing is that the student in question may never agree that he's derailing the discussion. That's what happens when people are not really interested in meaningful dialogue or understanding the opposite view. Some people will also be offended by the classroom analogy. You know what? You can't satisfy everyone. If you're offended by that, then I'm sorry, but I think it's a reasonable analogy here. Some say, "You know what? If these issues really matter to you, if you weren't such a coward, you would be responding to all of my comments." You know what? I don't care what you think. No offense. But I have more important things to do. Some people live on the internet. They live and breathe it. They spend all their time posting and arguing and discussing. I'm not that kind of person. If I have to choose between, say, arguing with somebody on the internet and helping a single mother in need, or putting in extra hours at work so that my coworkers can continue to draw a paycheck, guess what's going to take priority? I'm not beyond having meaningful discussions, but I prefer to have the discussion with people who are going to articulate their case meaningfully. By the way, I'm not just talking about non-believers here. Even Christian believers, if I disagree with something they say, I will perhaps argue with them, although I'll attempt to do so in a gracious manner. And those cases, the discussions tend to proceed more smoothly in any event. So, internet discriminations make things a lot more difficult. That's one reason why I moderate these videos. That's one reason why I don't choose to jump on every possible point of argumentation here. And that's for some reason why, if I see that the discussion is quickly going off the tracks, or is doomed to go off the tracks right from the beginning, I'm probably not going to waste time on it. Unless there's a really good point that I am choosing to illustrate. There are more important ways to use your time. And the internet can be such a time sink. It can really draw you in. I would like to be a better steward of my time than that, and I hope that you people will too.